class. I'm Teacher Cess, and today we are going to discuss comic strip as an assessment tool. Are you ready? Okay, that's good to hear that you are all ready. So now, let's start. Now class, let's first define what is a comic strip. Comic strip is a series of adjacent drawn images, usually arranged horizontally, that are designed to be read as a narrative or a chronological sequence. The story is usually original in this form. Words may be introduced within or near each image, or they may be dispensed with altogether. If words functionally dominate the image, it then becomes merely illustration to a text. The comic strip is essentially a mass medium printed in a magazine, a newspaper, or a book. The definition of a comic strip as essentially containing text inscribed within balloons inside the picture frame aspire to a certain orthodoxy in the United States, but it is unworkable and would exclude most strips created before about 1900 and many since. After knowing what is a comic strip, now let's discuss what are the advantages of using a comic strip as an assessment tool. First, let's start with comic strip is a great visual representation of knowledge. Second, comic strip presents what is essential. Third, comic strip is easier to remember a visual graphic containing a key information using a speech balloons and using drawings, sketch, and then comic strip is engaging through thinking, creating, and writing. Comic strip is also a perfect avenue for writing a dialogue. Comic strip also give insight students with low interest in writing. Comic strip also helps organization through storytelling and storyboarding. Here are some of the other advantages of using a comic strip. Comic strip use a visual images convey meaning to a story or a topic. Comic strip also develops creative and higher level thought processes. It develops composition techniques through visual verbal communications. Comic strip also enriches reading, writing, and thinking of every student. Comic strip also serves as an assessment and an evaluation tool, like I have said a while ago. And then lastly, comic strip is a assessment tool that promotes sequencing of events that promote understanding. After knowing the advantages of using a comic strip, now let's know what are the disadvantages of using a comic strip. First is using comic strip as an assessment tool. It can be manipulative. It means the personalizing quality of comics can be misused to manipulate the reader. And then next, some others says that using a comic strip is a little bit childish. The primary connotation of the comic book is that it is a medium of children, according to McAllister, 1992. So, that's the statement of McAllister that using a comic strip is a childish way. So that's contradicting to the one of the advantages of a comic strip that I have discussed a while ago, that comic strip is an effective way of assessing the children. So the next is comics and serious topics do not fit together. The idea of fun and entertainment is no inducement for a widespread acceptance of comics with serious and sad topics according to Jones 2010. So, some knows that a comic strip is used for fun. So, according to Junks, serious topics is not applicable using a comic strip. And here are the other disadvantages of using a comic strip. Comic strip has a limited textual content or content, limited space for a text, which can restrict the amount of information that can be conveyed. This may not be suitable for subjects that require in-depth explanation or complex concepts. Comic strip uses a small speech balloons, depends on how long the conversation is. And then next, simplified representations. So comic strip use simplified representations. The use of simplified visual representations may not accurately depict real-world scenarios or concepts. This can lead to misunderstanding or misconceptions among students. The third disadvantage of using a comic strip is when it comes to language and literacy skills. Comic strips heavily rely on visual cues and dialogue, which cannot or may not provide enough opportunities for children or students to develop their reading, comprehension, and critical thinking skills. Students may become dependent on visual aids and struggle with text-based materials. The fourth disadvantage is when it comes to the lack of depth and detail. Comic strip has limited space available that may not provide enough depth and detail on a certain topics. This is a disadvantage. This is a disadvantage studying complex subjects that require a thorough understanding. And the fifth disadvantage is cultural and gender representation. When it comes to cultural and gender representation, comic strip may not always reflect diverse cultural perspectives or accurately represent different genders. This can lead to biases or reinforce stereotypes among students. And the last disadvantage is the accessibility. Some students with visual impairments or learning disabilities may find it challenging to access and understand comic strip. For example, a visually impaired student, his or her learning can be limited using a comic strip. This can create barriers to learning and inclusivity. Now class, let's proceed on how comic strip used as an assessment tool. Okay, first, comic strip can use in conceptual understanding. Students can create comic strips that demonstrate their understanding of the key concepts. They can focus on the sequence of events, explain cause and effect relationships, or illustrate the steps of a process. This allows educators to assess students' comprehension of the subject matter. Subject matter. One of the example of using comic strip as an assessment tool in conceptual understanding is the comic strip entitled Smarty Betty. It shows how the propagation of sound happens. And the next is storytelling and narrative. Comic strips provide an opportunity for students to create narrative that incorporate the learned content. They can develop characters, plot lines, and dialogue that showcase their understanding of the topic. Educators can assess students' ability to construct coherent and meaningful stories that reflect their knowledge. One example of that is the comic strip entitled The Pickles. Comic strip can also use in assessing vocabulary and terminology of students. Students can use comic strip to showcase their understanding of the subject, specifically vocabulary and terminology. They can incorporate technical terms into dialogue or use visual cues to represent complex technical terms or concepts. Educators can assess students' ability to accurately and appropriately use domain-specific language. The next is comic strip can use in problem solving. Comic strip can be used to assess students' problem solving skills, wherein students can create comic strips that present a problem or challenge related to the topic and demonstrates how they would solve it. Educators can assess students' ability to apply their knowledge and critical thinking skills to real-world scenarios. And the next is comic strip can use in assessing reflection and analysis of every students. Comic strips can be used as a reflective tool for students to analyze and evaluate their learning. They can create comic strips that depict their learning journey, highlight key insights, or showcase their growth in understanding. Educators can assess students' ability to reflect on their learning process and articulate their thoughts through visual storytelling. And the last is comic strip can use in peer assessment. Comic strip can use for peer assessment wherein students evaluate and provide feedback on each other's work. Students can provide review their peers' comic strip based on the specific criteria such as accuracy, creativity, or clarity. This promotes collaboration, communication, and critical evaluation skills. Even though some others says that comic strip can't be used in a serious lessons or serious ideas, but here are some of the examples of comic strip used in teaching science, specifically the domain or the areas in Earth and space, physics, and biology. So, before we end, here are the references of our today's discussion, and we have a activity before we end, and you can do that at home. Direction: analyze the comic strip and make reflection paper on the present issue between the Philippines and China. The reflection paper will be rated according to the rubric given. Thank you, class, for listening for today's topic. I hope you learned and I hope you applied it in real life situations or in class situations.